Grand Duchess Tatiana was the second eldest daughter of the deposed Russian Emperor Nicholas II and his wife, the Empress Consort Alexandra. Described by Alexandra's lady-in-waiting Anna Vyrubova as the tallest and most graceful of all the Grand Duchesses, Tatiana was 21 years of age when the Russian Imperial family, the House of Romanov, were murdered at the hands of a firing squad in the basement of Ipatiev's house in Yekaterinburg on the 17th of July 1918. Tatiana would be a less common target for impostors in contrast to her younger sisters, the Grand Duchesses Maria and Anastasia. However, there were still a number of individuals who attempted to deceive others into believing that they were the legitimate Grand Duchess Tatiana who had been miraculously saved from execution. All of them would eventually be exposed as impostors, as the skeletal remains of the imperial family were recovered and identified through DNA testing in the 1990s and 2000s. This video aims to explore the lives and motivations of some of the individuals who either claimed to be, or were supposedly identified as being Grand Duchess Tatiana. These are the stories of Tatiana's impostors. The origin of Michelle Ange remains a mystery. However, information about her first emerged in the year 1923. That year, one of her few adherents, an individual named Frank Brunet, claimed that Michelle appeared in Siberia, where he met her and until 1924, lived there in an unnamed hotel in an unidentified city. It appears that she had moved to France by 1925, settling in one of the Parisian suburbs. While she resided in Paris, Michelle made plans to travel to Denmark in order to meet with the Dowager Empress Maria, who was the mother of the murdered Emperor Nicholas II, and supposedly present her with irrefutable evidence of her origin. However, her irrefutable evidence did not include an explanation of how she managed to escape from Yekaterinburg and the firing squad which murdered the rest of her family. In early 1926, Ange finally arranged her trip to Denmark to meet with Grand Duchess Tatiana's grandmother, the Dowager Empress Maria. However, this meeting was never to be, as Ange was found dead in her home, supposedly while preparing for the meeting, with the circumstances surrounding her death unclear and a mystery in itself. Whether her death was a murder or a suicide remains unknown, as the police did not reveal any details about her death to the public. With a lack of information surrounding the death of Michelle Ange, rumors surfaced that Bolsheviks had discovered her whereabouts and considered her convincing enough to pose a threat. This rumor may have been reinforced by Michelle's somewhat superficial resemblance to the Grand Duchess that she was impersonating, which set her apart from most other Romanov impostors, who looked very little like the murdered Grand Duchesses, a fact which many of you have pointed out in the comments section of our previous videos. The rumor follows that after her location was discovered, the Soviet authorities decided to murder Michelle in the conviction that she was the legitimate Grand Duchess Tatiana, who had escaped from Yekaterinburg and was attempting to reunite with the Dowager Empress in her native Denmark, where she had returned to following the Russian Revolution. The Dowager Empress firmly held on to the hope that her son Nicholas, daughter-in-law Alexandra, and her grandchildren Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia and Alexei had somehow survived and managed to escape post-revolutionary Russia. This is likely the reason why she would have been willing to meet Michelle Ange in person. It is worth noting that Nicholas II's sister, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, had also survived and escaped to Denmark like her mother, the Dowager Empress Maria. However, she herself would feel unsafe in the country in the aftermath of the Second World War, with the regime of Joseph Stalin accusing both her and a Danish Catholic bishop of conspiracy against the Soviet government. In the face of such accusations and the fear of either a kidnapping or an assassination attempt echoing the circumstances which surrounded Michelle Ange's death, Olga Alexandrovna eventually left Denmark for the safety of rural Canada in 1948. However, there have been a number of researchers who instead have been more inclined to think that the motivation behind Michelle's death, if it was murder, may have been more closely related to the division of alleged Romanov deposits in foreign banks, as she was a heritage scammer. Following her death, books written in French, English and Russian were found inside her house. A police check found out that the passport in the name of Michelle Ange was fake, indicating that even her name itself was a mystery. In 1933, one of Ange's few adherents, the aforementioned Frank Brunet, made the following statement.
I knew Grand Duchess Tatiana. I served as a doorman in one of the Siberian hotels, and one day, more precisely, in October 1923, a young woman of aristocratic appearance passed by me. I didn't know what her name was. But after a while, she called herself Michelle Ange. I used to talk to her in Russian and French. Michelle was fluent in both of these languages. One day I asked what kind of family she was from, and she trembled and burst into tears. Then, calming down, she said in a fallen voice,
I come from an aristocratic Russian family, unjustly executed by villains. I think you understand what kind of family we are talking about.
At first I didn't believe her, but after a while I came across a photograph of the Russian Imperial family in the newspaper. Among others, there was a photo of Tatiana. That's when I guessed that Michelle was actually Tatiana, the second daughter of the last Russian Tsar. I was about to visit her when I found out that Michelle had already left. She went to see her grandmother in Paris. I prayed to God that Mary would recognize her granddaughter. But a year later, I learned that Michelle had been found dead in a suburb of Paris.
Although Michelle Ange bared some superficial resemblance to Grand Duchess Tatiana in her appearance, that is where their similarities ended. With the remains of all the members of the Romanov family being discovered and identified through DNA testing, including Grand Duchess Tatiana, Ange was exposed as an impostor more than 60 years after her own tragic death. Who Michelle Ange was, where she was originally from, and what her real name may have been, appears to have been forever lost in time as a result of her tragic demise. Like many other Romanov impostors, very little is known about the history and background of Anastasia. What is known is that she first appeared in Canada in the year 1937, where she first publicly declared herself to be Grand Duchess Tatiana. It appears that she was unable to explain how she supposedly managed to escape captivity in Yekaterinburg and flee to safety. Ayert's claim came just over a decade before Nicholas II's aforementioned sister, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, moved to Canada herself. However, Ayert would not need to be disproven by a legitimate member of the Romanov family, as her lack of resemblance to the actual Grand Duchess Tatiana was enough for those who heard her claims in Canada at the time to easily dismiss them. Ayert's claims would not be taken seriously by anyone of note, and she faced ridicule in her assertions that she was the legitimate Tatiana who had fled post-revolutionary Russia. Both Ayert's composure and appearance appears to differ greatly from Grand Duchess Tatiana, who was well known for her elegant, refined features, her slenderness, dark brown hair, and her gentle, yet reserved manners. With such a contrast between the two, one could ask the question why Madame Ayert attempted to deceive others into believing that she was the legitimate Grand Duchess Tatiana. However, her motivations appear to be as vague as any other detail relating to her, and likewise lost through the passage of time. With Ayert having so little success in her attempt to convince people of her supposed Romanov origins, there is not much more of a story to reveal. However, during the course of the Second World War, either in the year 1942 or 1943, Madame Ayert was accused in Canada of sympathizing with the enemy and was forced to leave the country. Following this, Ayert relocated to Franco's Spain. It is not clear whether or not Madame Ayert continued to pose as Grand Duchess Tatiana while residing in Spain, but it is known that she died there in 1982 after suffering from an undisclosed medical condition, bringing this particular story to a close with perhaps more questions than answers. There is little information available about Larissa Tudor's nationality or early life. However, in 1923, she married Owen Frederick Morton Tudor, an officer of the 3rd Hussars at the Register Office of St. George's, Hanover Square, in London, England. Her marriage certificate listed her address as the York Hotel, Mayfair, and her father as Adolf Hauck. As well as this, her marriage certificate also listed her age as 27. According to the wife of one of Owen Tudor's fellow officers, there were two accounts about Larissa's background. One was that she was the daughter of a pork butcher, whom Tudor met when he was posted at Constantinople in 1921. In Constantinople, now modern-day Istanbul, Larissa was said to be a belly dancer at a nightclub. However, the second account of her early life was that she was a woman of a good family from St. Petersburg. The colonel of Owen Tudor's regiment reportedly sent fellow officers to either help teach him Russian before the marriage or to try to persuade him not to marry Larissa. Tudor, however, was in love with Larissa and proceeded with the marriage. Following this, Owen Tudor was forced to leave the regiment. One of Tudor's first cousins was told quite frankly that after Larissa had escaped from Russia she had been earning her living the only way she could. Following the marriage, Tudor transferred to the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Tank Corps, which was based in Kent, England. Larissa was ill with pulmonary tuberculosis and was unable to sit up straight. She spent her days reclining in an elongated bath chair. The couple lived a private life but were often overheard laughing in the garden of their house. Though Tudor's income had been reduced when he left the Hussars and he had no personal fortune, he had enough money to pay for a nurse to help Larissa and to keep a horse stabled at a farm nearby. Larissa died on the 18th of July 1926, and her death certificate gave her age as 29. Following her death, Larissa left an inheritance that amounted to 2 years' pay for most of Britain's population at the time. Owen Tudor was said to have been devastated by his wife's death and had to be held up by other men at her gravesite. Larissa was buried in a cemetery in Kent. Her gravestone bore the inscription "To my very beloved Larissa Fyodorovna, who died July 18, 1926, aged 28 years, the wife of Owen Tudor, 3rd the King's Own Hussars." Tudor brought flowers to her grave every year on June the 10th up until a few years before his own death. The fact that Grand Duchess Tatiana had also been born on June the 10th was a detail noted by a group of women in Kent who had become fascinated by Larissa's story following her death. This group contacted an author by the name of Michael Ockleshaw and informed him of Larissa's story. Ockleshaw saw irregularities in the available information about Larissa, such as the different ages given on her death certificate and tombstone, as well as differences in the names given for her. Ockleshaw also investigated the conflicting stories about her background, along with Tudor's inexplicable income, and returned to the 3rd Hussars with a promotion in rank following Larissa's death. As well as this, there was no record of a woman named Larissa Houck entering England between 1918 and 1923. Ockleshaw showed portraits of Grand Duchess Tatiana along with portraits of unrelated women from the same period to people who had known Larissa. More than 60 years after Larissa's death, her former neighbors identified portraits of the Grand Duchess as Larissa. Larissa was described as being tall, amazingly thin and very beautiful, having brown hair with an auburn tinge to it. This physical description was similar to descriptions of the Grand Duchess Tatiana, wrote Ockleshaw. Ockleshaw speculated that Tatiana was flown out of Siberia by British agents in July 1918 and with assistance from the Japanese, transferred into the hands of Prince Arthur, who was traveling from Japan to Canada aboard the Japanese battle cruiser Kirishima in July 1918. With the prince's party, the rescued Grand Duchess allegedly traveled across Canada before she sailed to the United Kingdom on the Canadian Pacific Ocean Service limited vessel Corsican, which arrived in the United Kingdom in August 1918. Ockleshaw speculated that a rescue mission by air might have been considered by the British at the behest of King George V. An entry in the journal of Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen asserts that the rescue took place on July 1, 1918, a date that might have been inaccurate. Meinertzhagen wrote that the rescue was not a complete success because not all the family was rescued, stating that one of the 4 daughters was literally thrown into the plane at Yekaterinburg, much bruised, and brought to England. Critics say that Meinertzhagen's diaries were fantasy. Meinertzhagen's wife, Amorelle, traveled from Canada to the United Kingdom aboard the Canadian ship Corsican in August 1918, while the war was still taking place. In the adjoining cabin was a 22-year-old masseuse named Margarita Lindsay, for whom Ockleshaw could find no birth or permanent address records. Ockleshaw identified Margarita Lindsay as a possible cover name for a rescued Grand Duchess. However, there were 2 separate listings for travel to New York by passengers named Margarita Lindsay in 1915 and again in 1923. The Margarita Lindsay who traveled in 1915 gave her age as 18 and her place of residence as Montreal, Quebec, Canada, while the Margarita Lindsay who traveled in 1923 gave her age as 27 and her residence as New York City. The Bolsheviks were also reportedly alarmed by an airplane flying over Ipatiev's house in mid-July 1918, Sir Charles Elliot, the British High Commissioner for Siberia, later reported. When interrogated by White Russian Army investigators in January 1919, a Red Guard named George Byron, the chief military communications officer of the Bolshevik Third Army at Perm, claimed Tatiana had run away or disappeared with a Red Army officer, a commander of the Guard, before the murder of the Tsar. A photograph which appeared in 1918 inside the September 4th edition of the Harrogate Herald depicts a group of exiled royalty and aristocrats including Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna, who was living at Harrogate. Akhilshaw speculates that the young woman in this photo, whose face is half hidden behind Lady Radcliffe, the wife of Sir Joseph Radcliffe, might be the escaped Grand Duchess. In his opinion, the photograph bears, in his words, an uncanny resemblance to the Grand Duchess Tatiana. This woman was the only person in the group who was not identified in the newspaper photo caption. Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna founded 4 hospitals in the area. A sanatorium for treatment of tuberculosis was located near Harrogate at Knaresborough. Akhilshaw also speculated that the conditions under which the Romanovs were held would have been ideal for a member of the imperial family to contract tuberculosis. Guards at the Ipatiev house, where the imperial family was held captive at Yekaterinburg, later commented on the sickly appearance of Grand Duchess Tatiana and her elder sister Olga. Tatiana had grown extremely thin and, according to one guard, looked as if she was not far from the morgue. Since Larissa had mentioned to her neighbors that her happiest time in England had been spent in Yorkshire, Akhilshaw speculated that the escaped Grand Duchess might have spent time in a medical facility near Harrogate under the patronage of Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna. Owen Tudor's uncle was Sir Frederick Tudor, a British admiral who was the commander of the China Station in 1918. Frederick Tudor was responsible for arranging the escape of refugees from Siberia to Japan and then on to Canada. Akhilshaw speculated that Owen Tudor might have met Larissa during a visit to his uncle. When Akhilshaw had conducted his research, 2 bodies were missing from the mass Romanov grave found in Siberia and exhumed in 1991. Those bodies were identified as Tsarevich Alexei of Russia and one of the 4 Grand Duchesses, generally thought by Russians to be Maria and by Americans to be Anastasia. In July 2007, a 46-year-old builder by the name of Sergei Pogorelov, who was part of a team from an amateur history group who spent free summer weekends looking for the lost Romanovs, said that after stumbling on a small burned area of ground covered with nettles near Yekaterinburg, he had discovered bones that belonged to a boy and a young woman roughly the ages of Nicholas' 13-year-old hemophiliac son, Alexei, and one of his daughters. On the 30th of April 2008, DNA tests were performed on the 2 bodies. A United States laboratory compared DNA from the bodies to a DNA sample given by Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose first cousins once removed were the Romanov children. The test confirmed that the bodies belonged to members of the imperial family, Tsarevich Alexei and Grand Duchess Maria. Therefore, all the Romanovs had been accounted for, disproving claims of survival. Larissa Tudor's history and true identity remain a mystery. However, whoever she was not Grand Duchess Tatiana. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoy the content we produce here at Heart for History, please like and subscribe. And please feel free to leave a comment, as your feedback is greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and we'll see you again soon.